For those of you who don't know, I am the author of the forthcoming book, please don't ask me when it's coming out, Web Accessibility Made Easy, which is essentially the only guide to WCAG 2.1 and all of the related technologies involved in complying with it. So hopefully I can answer the majority of your questions today. Let's get started. So I've got a few questions that we received before. So I'm going to get us kicked off with these. The first question, and probably one of the most popular questions we ever receive, is what is the best way to make PDFs accessible? And unfortunately, this is a really popular question for terrible reasons. It's because it's really, really hard to do. And so many public sector members have to comply with this. And honestly, I don't think there's a single one who relishes that challenge. It's pretty difficult. I've got a few headline points to get you started. If this is something people want to go into more, I could easily do an hour on this, but to get you going, the first thing I'd recommend is using the native file if possible. And what I mean by that is if you have a Word document, especially, and a lot of PDFs are Word documents, you don't want to try and fix the PDF. What you want to do is you want to go into Word, and there's a couple of options. You can easily Google this information, but it's very simple. If you set a couple of options when you export a Word file into a PDF, it will do most of the work of making it accessible for you. And if you're doing the Word document correctly, it will do basically all the work. So again, that's probably almost a 5-10 minute demo in itself. I'm not going to cover today, but it's quite straightforward if you wanted to Google it. Basically, as long as you're using semantic headings in Word and a few other things, when you export the Word document, you can embed all the alternative text, you can do all of those things, and you just get a PDF that works out the gate. And that is always the easiest approach if you can do it. So I highly, highly recommend doing that with Word files. I know you're not going to like this answer, but making a HTML version is often the best answer. It does, of course, depend on the PDF and the content. If the content is relatively straightforward to copy and paste, for example, if it's linear content like paragraphs and headings, it's often the easiest option. It does depend. The canonical answer to this question is, and I'm rolling my eyes here for a reason, Adobe Acrobat. So we do use a lot of tools at Silktide to help with this task. And I've used Acrobat a lot. I've used a number of others. Because I'm a Mac user, it's generally quite difficult. There's more tools on Windows than there are on Mac. But annoyingly, Acrobat is probably the best tool, even though it's terrible. I wish I didn't have to give that answer. It does make it relatively easy to comply with some of the basics, such as providing headings and languages. Where it falls down, in my experience, it is quite slow. It has a tendency to crash. And if you're getting outside of the basic accessibility requirements, so if you need to get into something more complex like tagging, it can be a bit of a pain. But it is still probably the least bad tool out there. The secret answer number 4 is Silktide is actually releasing our own competitor to that. So I might be biased. But it isn't out yet, so that'll just have to be a watch this space. But we kind of got annoyed with having to apologize for Acrobat all the time, so we tried to build something better. That's later on this year. Anyway, so that's our first question. Next question, quite a common one as well. When, if ever, should you use empty alternative text? So for the HTML friendly among you, this little piece of code at the bottom, image alt is empty, basically. And it's worth understanding, if you don't know, that is actually different from not specifying alt text. So you could literally just do an image and not specify it at all. Or you could do an image and you could specify an empty alt text. And that is actually different, believe it or not. A lot of people don't know this. If you have an image and you don't specify alt text, most of the time the screen reader will do its best to guess what it should put in there, and its guesses are notoriously awful. So you will typically get something like an image, it will read out the file name of the image, and that is a really, really bad experience for, say, a blind user, when every time they get an image, what they have is, it reads out icon 176.png or something. So for that reason, if nothing else, you should specify alt equals blank rather than omitting it entirely. But why would you do that? Why is that important? Well, let's just quickly recap what alt text is actually for. So this is an example of, say, 3 images in a fictional menu where you might ask someone to select from the following 3 options. And in this case, you're asking someone to pick between 3 images. So because I'm a sighted user, I can easily see what those images are, and I could choose and click on one of them. But if I was, say, blind or even just visually impaired to the point where I needed to rely on a computer to help me see those images, then I might use a screen reader, and a screen reader would read out those images. It would turn them into text. So it would say something like pear image, banana image, apple image. That's a quite common use of alt text. And the alt text here is that piece of text before the hyphen, right? So pear, banana, apple. Now, in this really simple and slightly contrived example, that is incredibly useful. This is, in fact, essential, actually. You couldn't really make this example accessible without providing alt text. And that's usually what people are taught. They're taught, you know, just provide a text to describe the image. This is why it's important. But it's kind of simplifying it a bit. So let me show you a little bit more detail. This is a slightly more practical example where the absence of alt text is absolutely devastating to accessibility. So here you've got an example of a instructions on how to charge a phone, right? And the image is actually showing you something that is not present in the text around it, right? So this image is showing you where to put the charger into the phone in order to actually charge it. Now, if you imagine you couldn't see that image, if that image was just deleted and all you got was the alternative text on the left, you just have the words charging phone. That is a very common example of alt text that people will provide. They'll just go, oh, this is image, charging phone, done. But if you actually think about what the image is trying to achieve, the example on the right is more practical. So this would say something like plug cable into the bottom edge of the phone. So it's actually describing the information that's relevant. And this, unfortunately, it can be quite tricky to make this judgment call, but you just want to think if the image is showing you something pertinent. So for example, if you had a graph showing coronavirus cases going up or down, your alternative text might need to say something like, you know, graph showing increase of coronavirus cases from pretend 100 a day to 200 a day or whatever it is, something like that. And you wouldn't want to put alternative text that just says chart or graph of coronavirus cases because the crucial information inside it would be lost. The alternative is to write this text around it. So you don't put it in as alt text, but you make it somewhere else on the page. But as asked by the question, why would you sometimes not do this? Why would you omit this alt text if it's so useful? Well, here's another example menu, and this is probably the most common example, where you've got a selection of 4 options, but each option has text and it has an image next to it. So you've got auditory, visual, motor, and cognitive, and each one of these has an icon. So if you were to just do the obvious thing here, you provide alt text for those images, you might put something like ear receiving sound or eye crossed out or finger pointing as your alt text, right? So you would just add that alt text for each one of these images. But then what would actually happen for a user who is, say, experiencing your site through a screen reader, so someone who's, say, blind or partially sighted, they would have this read out to them. So they would hear ear receiving sound, image, auditory, link, and then eye crossed out, image, visual, link, and so on. So what's actually happening in many ways is you've made the experience worse. The alternative text is distracting. It's actually a burden on the user. And in fact, what you'd be better off doing is something like this. If you removed the alt text from those images, you would just have auditory link, visual link, motor link, and cognitive link, which would make for a much simpler and more accessible experience. So in this case, basically, the images, knowing those images and what's inside them is irrelevant, right? They don't actually add sort of the utility of this menu. They, in fact, would take away from it. If you're sighted, they're a nice little aid. And in fact, if you're dyslexic, they're particularly useful because you may struggle to read the text. But if you're partially sighted, then they're actually a hindrance. So in this case, I would recommend empty alt text for these images. Here's a quick cheat sheet for you. If the image is purely decorative, so it's like a sunset in the background or something, it doesn't need it. If you couldn't see the image, would important information be lost? If it is, then you definitely need alt text. And would alt text be duplicated? So for example, sometimes you have a picture of a car next to the word car. And if you set the alt text to car, then it would just say car image car, which is kind of pointless. So just avoid that if you can. So hopefully that answers that question. Moving on, a nice simple one. This is quite frequently asked. When does the Silktide Index update? So I'll just break this down quickly for those of you who don't know. It's really simple. We test around the 20th of each month. I say around because, of course, there are weekends, but the aim is approximately 1 week before the end of the month. And you should know that it actually takes typically a couple of days to actually run through all of the sites. So even if we started on the 20th, yours might be on the 21st or something like that. We will experience typically at least a few websites that failed to test, usually because those websites were down at the time. For example, they were being serviced, or they, I don't know, had something like Cloudflare, which tried to block us, that kind of thing. And we retry those automatically, but they may end up running a day or two later than that. And then we manually check a sample of the results that we get back. And we do this to make sure that nothing crazy has happened. We're constantly changing our platform. We're updating criteria. We sometimes refine the way that we, say, decide what pages to test. And so to make sure that the results are accurate, we do a manual audit of those results. We don't have time, of course, to check every single page of every single site, but we check a sample and it just indicates that nothing has gone horribly wrong. And then lastly, we make the results live on the first Monday of the month. Or if that's a bank holiday, I guess it would be the first Tuesday. So essentially, there's a delay during which we're just making sure the results are correct. And also we're gathering the results together so they can all be shown at once. Otherwise, you would have this kind of weird experience where some sites would bump up the rankings and then they would go down the next day and so on. So we want it to be one clean atomic change. Hopefully that answers your question. So next up, another common one. Why are my Silktide results different from other automated or manual tests? So quite a few people ask this, and the question actually belies perhaps a difference in interpretation for how these things work. So a common misunderstanding is that WCAG, that's the official guidelines that you're following, are a flawlessly defined, unambiguous standard. And unfortunately, that is not the case. So I'm going to kind of show you a little bit of why. There is some subjectivity. So to give you an example, there are numerous requirements in WCAG for the use of appropriate division of content into logical units, and in particular, units like headings, which users can skim, but they can also jump to. So we could get complicated here, but the simple version is something like what you see on the right-hand side is a good experience, and something like what you see on the left-hand side is generally a bad experience. However, the requirements for this are not stated in a way that a computer or even a person could unambiguously assess them. We might say things like headings should make logical sense, but as a person, sometimes you might disagree with the choice of headings. Sometimes you might disagree with the frequency of them, or the wording, or the other aspects of them. And those things generally fall on some kind of grade, right? So you've got areas where the headings are brilliant. You've got areas where the headings are terrible. And then you've got a spectrum of what an automated platform can look for. So a computer can easily say this page has a heading, and it can even say this page has, let's say, a heading every 5,000 words or whatever. But setting those specific criteria and unambiguously measuring them as like pass or false is pretty much impossible. And no one, including the people who invented the standards, has done this. Another example, here's page titles, right? So a page title is typically seen in your web browser like this, something like face masks and visors, coronavirus, etc. And these are all classic examples of a page title. There are lots of differences in interpretation as to what constitutes a good title. Some of this is officially stipulated, some of this is recommended, and some of this has kind of been bolted on afterwards as like best practice, but not actually within WCAG itself. So we do our best, as do all of the tools, to abide by the latest and best interpretation of WCAG, and to automate those criteria in a way that is consistent and can be explained and can actually be actioned on. But the point is, there isn't a definitive check that anyone could write that would actually say, for example, I don't know, a title of, let's say, ABC is probably useless, but maybe there's a weird exotic piece of criteria where it is useful. However, just because you have a long title, that doesn't actually mean your title is brilliant. So it's just worth understanding the limitations and the subjectivity that goes into that. Another thing that comes into this is the criteria. So different tools and different methodologies, like manual and automated, will cover different things. One of the main areas that Silktide, for example, focuses on is a really, I mean, I'm going to toot my own horn here, but it's a differentiator for us, is we actually test your website in mobile. And as far as we know, we are the only platform to do this. And the reason we do this is because WCAG 2.1, the latest version of the standard, actually requires a variety of criteria met for a mobile experience, right? The short version is your website should work perfectly on something like an iPhone 5, so a quite old, small-screened mobile device, but it gets a lot more nuanced than that. The broad version is something like what you're seeing here on the right would definitely be considered failing WCAG 2.1. That experience is not great for anyone, but it's actually classified as inaccessible under the latest version of WCAG. And Silktide, as far as we know, alone in automated platforms is capable of testing for this. But because others aren't, their scoring can differ. Also, a lot of manual testing often omits this. If you were, for example, manually testing your site for WCAG 2.0, or if you were having mobile experiences tested, but maybe on a larger phone, you might get different results. And that's all part and parcel of the nature of testing on mobile. Even things like this. By the way, if you don't know why this is bad, you probably have experienced a mobile site that does something like what you're seeing here on the right. But imagine if you're a user with limited motor capabilities, you may not even be using this on a phone. You might be using this on a monitor, magnified to compensate for visual loss or similar. Scrolling in one dimension is quite straightforward, right? You can have controls that go, next and previous. But as soon as you start doing things like what you've got here on the right, you need to scroll in 2 dimensions. You need to be able to scroll across and down and left and up, and in order to actually see and read the text, which is actually quite physically demanding in many cases, right? It's the difference between I can look at that left-hand screen and just read it, but the right-hand screen, I have to go right, left, down, right, and so on, and move around, which again is irritating for pretty much any user. But if you've got, say, a disability, that can actually be incredibly demanding, and needlessly so. So that's one of the reasons why that's a new criteria they check for in WCAG 2.1. Anyway, and then the third reason is because your different methodologies will result in different levels of coverage. So in other words, different things will be tested. So I'm going to give you a very quick high-level overview of manual versus automated testing. So manual testing typically focuses on a few pages. So I say a few, that can be 10, it maybe is 20. It's rarely over 20 or 30 pages, right? And it's usually orientated around specific use cases. So things like go to our website and find the coronavirus information page, or make a support query, fill in this form, that kind of thing. Automated testing tends to look at all pages, so it will get more coverage, but it won't tend to cover those interactions. So it won't follow through on them like a human being would, right? So like a person might go, I am looking for this, I'm going to fill in this form, I'm going to submit it, I'm going to then navigate here, because that's how people think. A computer doesn't get that, but it will look at all of the pages that it can publicly see an address for. So it's worth understanding they'll just see different things. And then manual testing, of course, is focused around a real experience. So a person will look at a page and they will say, you know what, the headings on this page make no sense to me. You've got headings on the page, but I don't understand them. They don't help me understand. They don't help me navigate. When I'm skipping through it with a screen reader, all I get is these confusing headings, and I'm lost. So that real experience is beneficial. You'll get more out of that real experience. Automated testing, of course, is simulating that experience. So a computer is doing its best to appreciate that, and it won't quite get the same things. In some cases, it will actually get more. So, for example, computers will measure color contrast in a mathematical way that is designed to simulate what a huge number of visual disabilities would be like, right? And so it's actually likely the computer will have a pretty good understanding of that, whereas a person can only judge something with their own eyes. And unless you can get, like 12 types of color blindness tested separately by people and different things like varying levels of cataracts and glaucoma and so on, unless you have those things tested by different people, the simulated experience can in some ways be better. But for other areas like comprehension, real experience absolutely trounces what a computer can do. So as a result, the manual testing can miss issues not found on all pages. That's kind of like the biggest weakness. But on the other hand, automated testing will tend to miss the subjective human issues that only a human being would realize. I mention this because if you can probably guess by now, you really should be doing both. There's no shorthand for this. You kind of need a combination. Where we recommend they're particularly strong, manual testing is best generally at the template level, like at the design level. If you're building a new site or refreshing it, it's really good because you can get those kind of fundamentals working really well. And that works well when you're only looking at a small subsection of your site. Whereas automated testing tends to be better for ongoing checking, because chances are you're constantly adding content to your site, you're constantly expanding it. And if you're doing that, automated testing can tell you, 5 minutes, even potentially 5 seconds after you've made a change to your site, you've done something. Whereas manual testing, of course, you'd have to commission a group and they'd have to go through it and you have to read the results and so on. So really, there is no like one size fits all answer here. We highly recommend using both. Obviously, we're biased, we're automated, but we still rely on manual a lot, and we highly recommend that everyone else does. So collectively, those 3 reasons are the main reasons why your results between, say, Silktide and any other approach may differ. There isn't a consistent one-size-fits-all way of testing a site, and depending on the approach you use, you can expect to get different things back. Which leads us neatly to this question, which is another very, very frequently asked question, which is how do we know if we're accessible? So we often get asked some version of this. Is there a score? Is there a threshold? Is there some other criteria? Everyone wants to know, show me the tick box that says I am 100% accessible or I am not. And again, this is often a misunderstanding, I think. It's easy to see where this comes from because the requirements in the law are pretty much, you must be accessible, but then no one actually quite gets into the finer points of, yes, but what does that mean really? The truth is, accessibility is more of a scale, like a continuum, rather than a switch. It's definitely not something that is on or off. So we would say there's something like at one end, you've got something that is totally inaccessible. And on the other end, you've got something that is a brilliant experience for all users. Obviously, you want to be as far to the right as possible. And this is what we're grading you on. But there are certain levels of accessibility failing that would almost certainly leave you open to, well, certainly if you're in America, you'd be open to lawsuits, but would be unambiguously interpreted as totally inaccessible. Simple example would be something like what you saw earlier with those images, where you had a series of images and you were asked to click on an image, but there was no alt text. You literally couldn't know what you were clicking on. So you'd be asked to click on image, image, or image if you were, say, blind. That would be sort of a classic unambiguous example. There are many cases, however, where it's more subjective. So let me give you an example. There is a requirement in WCAG that content is easy to understand. And I forget the UK equivalent, but I think it's like approximately a reading age, somewhere around 12 years, 13 years of age, which is actually surprisingly high. But basically, your text should be easily understood by as many people as possible. Now, here are 2 examples of the same content. and it's quite clear to a human being that what you see on the right is easier to understand than what is on the left. And indeed, a computer can determine this as well. We have all sorts of math and formula that's designed to assess this. But at the same time, how would you actually grade that? Would you grade one as a pass and one as a failure? Or, I mean, like, technically, the material on the left is, depending on your interpretation, accessible in that you can at least hear it or, read it. It's just a bad experience. A pretty strong case in this example could be made that this is failing a AAA requirement, especially. But it isn't as simple as yes or no. And what if we took the example on the right, which is, say, pretty good, and we just added one sentence that failed that criteria? Would that make the entire page a failure? Would it make the entire website a failure? Probably not. So the truth is that accessibility, as I said, tends to be graded on a continuum. And again, this comes back to the whole manual and automated testing. You want to be thinking of the automated testing as giving you broad coverage and the manual testing as giving you the in-depth human experience. And as long as you're actually doing this, you're engaging with this process, you're understanding the problems and you're fixing them, you are basically about as accessible as anyone is actually ever going to get. Even the people who wrote the standards don't meet the fullest level of that standard, as in AAA, across the board, unambiguously accessible. It's something to strive for, but generally you just want to be aiming to max out your single and your AA compliance as we measure it on a percentage, and you want to be getting a high score for that. And I appreciate that is probably the kind of woolly answer that you don't want to hear, but unfortunately, the law and indeed the standards themselves don't explicitly state here is a pass and here is a fail, and it's probably because they can't. I can say I'm working with people on WCAG 3 and the new standard, or it's got all sorts of code names and they're messing around with whether they'll call it WCAG 3, but the latest and next version of the standard that is probably many years away, they are aware of this problem and they are looking at ways of making it unambiguous. So they are considering having a straight pass-fail, or perhaps more likely a sort of like an ABC kind of, level grade that could actually be measured and certified. But at the moment, there really isn't such a thing. Another thing I recommend, by the way, is if you're looking at manual testing, but you haven't got the time/money to throw a wide range of people with disabilities at your website, an alternative, we provide this free toolbar. You can check it out, silktide.com/toolbar, and it lets you simulate a wide range of disabilities. Also, because you all have Socitm reports, if you've ever looked at the inspector, which is basically when you look at a single page in your report, we actually provide a button, I don't know if you can see this here, where it says simulate dyslexia. Depending on the issue we are raising, we will usually offer to simulate a given disability that is relevant to that issue. So for example, here we're looking at a website where it's talking about text being hard to read. And if I was to choose to simulate that dyslexia, you can actually see here what the sentences might look like, and then you can interpret whether or not subjectively, if that actually looks like it would be super hard to understand, or if it's not really that much of a problem. So there are ways that you can kind of blend automated and manual together, and we're working on that continuously. But for the most part, you want to look at a mixture. Right. So anyway, that was all of my fixed material for standard questions. So actually, now the new most upvoted question is, what will be the penalty in the UK for having an inaccessible website? Aha, who will enforce this? Good question. Difficult answer. So GDS are responsible for policing it. As far as enforcing it, I'm less clear, if I'm being honest. I think, if I'm being brutally honest, and this is the non-PC answer, I think it's going to initially be a lot like GDPR, which is to say there will be sternly written letters and there will be negative press associated with organizations that fail. But I very much doubt they're going to be like, right, well, we've just decided we're going to bomb a county into oblivion because they failed to do something in this area. As far as the personal consequences for the individuals working in those organizations, I can't really speak to that because that would come down to the organization. But I certainly think it would be poorly reflected on them from a personal job perspective. Say you're responsible for a website, and that website is publicly lambasted for not being accessible under the new criteria, that would not reflect well on anyone. Of course, perhaps the better question to ask is, what effect does this actually have on your constituents, your citizens? And the reality is, especially nowadays with coronavirus and lockdown, this has never been more important. You're looking at millions of people, literally millions of people, who depend upon the website in order to perform basic and critical functions in their lives. And if a website is not made to be accessible, then you're denying them that access. It's like, I don't know, building a modern building now and not providing wheelchair access. It's morally abhorrent, if nothing else. Yeah, okay, so I'll consider that answered for a moment. How can you make information presented in a map accessible? Okay, so this is tricky. There are actually specific exemptions for maps, partly because the people responsible know it is such a nightmare. You clearly can't do like an alternative text in a traditional way, right? You can't just describe everything in a map, because you can't frame it with enough detail to not lose information. So generally what it ends up getting converted to is directions where that's possible. So if for example, if you were trying to say something like how to find our office, you might say it's off this road, or easily accessed from the train station, that kind of thing. But it's not actually considered realistic to present a like-for-like experience with a full-blown map, because simply put, you cannot provide that density of information in the same way. It can't be done any more than you could. For example, this QR code on the left here, you could show someone that image, but you simply couldn't describe it in a way that would be meaningful. So there are exemptions for that, and I would aim for directions and plain text equivalent, but that's basically it. Oops. Right, local authorities usually have a lot of separate sites. Can one accessibility statement cover all of them? Well, it kind of depends. So the division on a website is a little bit subjective. So most of us tend to think of separate websites as a separate web address. So for example, I don't know, silktide.com or silktide.co.uk, under some definitions, people might see those as separate sites. Or you could just say it's the same site in a different country. There isn't a scientific agreement on what that means. So the accessibility statement could be shared as long as the statement is covering the material in all of them, and as long as you're linking to that statement from all of them. Those are the main criteria. So you just want to make sure that if someone is on any of those sites, they can get the information that's relevant. Right. Next up, how do we make tables accessible on all devices? Well, kind of two questions there. One is with tables. So it's kind of implied that you're asking about mobile, I think, and that is almost separate from how you make tables accessible. There's a little bit of an overlap. So what I would do, firstly, there are some occasions where you really do need a table, right? So if you're just doing a bulleted list, please don't use a table. But if you're doing like structured data, like let's say name of someone and I don't know, their age and address and email and something like that, maybe that would be relevant. Or coronavirus, sorry, it's all coronavirus right now. Coronavirus statistics on, let's say, cases and deaths and so on. That kind of information makes sense as a table. If you're doing that, you need to be semantically correct, which means you're using things to identify the headings for the tables correctly and link them to the rows. That is just a kind of a core compliance requirement. We test for that. It's pretty straightforward. You can Google for it. I can send you a link, but it's well defined. A lot of CMSs won't do it properly. Just check, but it does depend on your system. And then the other thing is, if you're trying to make them accessible on mobile, that gets tricky. So horizontal scrolling is generally out. There can be some very rare allowances for that, but you want to try and avoid it. There are some tricks you can do with CSS that will take a table and will format it into a sequence. So for example, you can take a HTML table and have it broken down into like a long set of, say, grouped bullet points. That can be done. And there are plugins that will do that. And there are fairly standard tutorials you'll find again on the web for how to make a straightforward HTML table work on, say, a mobile browser. So that's that one. Do bolt-on products like Browse aloud and recite me solve the problem of accessible PDFs and text as they claim? No. Sorry. They try. No. So now, to be fair, I'm not a full expert on the latest versions of these products. We do have experience working with organizations who use them. So the problem you have is, unfortunately, well, we're actually working on the same problem ourselves right now. So as I mentioned earlier, we're working on a new PDF addition to our suite that will help you make PDFs more accessible. So we're very familiar with the technical minutiae of this one. The problem fundamentally is some PDFs do not even contain the information that you could read out. So what you may not know is Adobe themselves will actually allow you to read out a PDF anyway. If you're using a screen reader, you can read a PDF. You don't need a special product to do it. That isn't the problem. The problem is you need to understand the parts of the document that are not just in the text. You need to be able to navigate those documents. So for example, skip to the next heading or skip to the next link or whatever, form, for example. And you also, you need, in many cases, to actually understand things that are not turned into text in the first place. So imagine you've got a PDF, and we see a lot of these every week, where you've got a PDF, and to a person, it just looks fine. It looks like maybe a calendar, for example, saying what events are coming up in the new year or something like that. But when you actually try and read it with a screen reader, it just says image. And that's because the software they've used has turned all of the text and all of the fonts, has just turned them into images. So each character is just an image. And if you think that's horrifying and unlikely, it's surprisingly common. A massive number of PDFs are like that. Now, the problem is if you have a PDF like that, Browse aloud, recite me, and everything else can't read it. They literally can't see it. All they're going to see is an image as well. And there's no real way for a computer to fix that because the image doesn't contain the text, if that makes sense. It needs a person to go in there and to fix it. I could go on about this for a long time. Honestly, the cause they're advocating for is noble, but if you work with users with disabilities who, for example, require something to read out text to them, they don't want a plugin that reads out text to them because they use a plugin to use their computer already, right? They're using a screen reader that they've possibly spent 3 or 4 years of their life mastering. They know all the shortcuts through. They know how to literally operate it blind by definition. And then they come to a website and someone's bought a plugin that claims to read out a PDF for them. And they're like, well, I can already do that because my computer is set up to read everything, every single screen, pop-up notice, email, whatever. So it does. A lot of the time, it's kind of an exercise in vanity, unfortunately, and it feels good, and it allows you to, unfortunately, get to those core criteria where you just go, well, we're trying to be accessible, but it doesn't actually do much for end users. So right. What's the best way to create an accessibility statement? What should go in it? Okay, so there's actually a lot of really good resources on this. I don't have to hand, but there are. W3C made a standard one, I think. Accessibility standards. Oh, no, sorry, template. What do you call it? Statement, thank you. Oh, there you go, they've even got a generator. So yeah, this is not terrible. You can play around with this. There are others. I think GDS has one, actually. But yeah, there's actually quite a lot of pretty reasonable templates and starting points out there. The basic fundamentals are pretty standard, and again, just use one of those templates. Where it gets a bit trickier is in some cases you won't know the answers, and that's why you need to get some testing and figure out where you actually stand, and of course keep it up to date as well. Right. Oh no, we've had this one. Oh no, actually no, we haven't. Sorry, my bad. Local authorities often have several sites. How do you recommend approaching this by the deadline, especially as one is by far the biggest main site? If you don't have time, or like time is limited, and I guess to some extent it always is, you should focus on what is getting the most attention. Analytics could be useful there. You could look at what content is being seen the most. Realistically, I think an analogy is almost to think of it in a real world scenario, right? So this is quite helpful with a lot of computer technology. Imagine you were a supermarket and there are laws concerning the accessibility of your supermarket to customers, which there are. So you need to, for example, tackle things like no one can get in your shop because a wheelchair can't, there's a step or something, you need a ramp. You need to tackle those things first, right? So the website equivalent would be your homepage is completely inaccessible to a screen reader, or your navigation doesn't work for people with a keyboard, for example, right? Those kind of things, you've got to fix those because that's the equivalent of no one can get in your store. But then imagine someone in a wheelchair can go around your store, but they can't access some of the products on the higher shelves. Now, that would normally be understood, right? There would be a reasonable level of understanding that if there are some items that are not physically practical to reach, but assistance is available, then that could be seen as nevertheless you are complying with the law and you're accessible, you're doing your best endeavors. A lot of it comes down to the frequency and the severity of the barrier, right? If you're saying the only way you can apply for a passport is via a form and the form is inaccessible, you are stopping people who do not meet those criteria. But if you've got one page in a 10,000 page website that isn't 100% accessible, but that page gets viewed 3 times a year, it's probably not going to be the end of the world. And as long as you can reasonably help with those things, that's where your accessibility statement comes in, then you can normally get around it. So, okay, so that's that one and that one. I presume based on the fact that PDFs don't resize for mobile devices, they fail. Right, so this is actually a controversial topic. I agree with you. I would argue because PDFs don't resize for mobile devices, they fail. And that's actually why I think, if nothing else, PDFs should be killed and burned. They should suffer the fate of Flash animation, which is oddly enough created by the same company. As far as I'm concerned, it's basically impossible to make a PDF fully accessible. That's my assessment. Some people will argue that one. Adobe does have the facility in their reader to reflow a PDF so that it doesn't scroll horizontally. They have that facility. It's an obscure facility, but a disabled user has a higher chance of knowing about that than average. It does depend on their browser, their reader. It definitely adds a barrier. It's not going to apply to everyone. And on mobile, it's not really supported. So there's all sorts of problems with it, but they're trying sort of to achieve that. Personally, I would just say don't use PDFs. GDS will tell you don't use PDFs. I personally think the long-term future of PDFs is that they're practically outlawed, like Flash animation will be one of those things which no one touches. But because they're so ubiquitous, it's probably going to take years before we get there. So if possible, just don't use them. If an external company provides a website for us, do they have a responsibility to ensure? Right. They don't unless you've stipulated it. You can, so imagine again, you're a supermarket, right? You're a supermarket and you build a new building and you don't make it compliant with accessibility legislation, with your specific accessibility legislation, like your hospital or something. That's your fault, not theirs. So you should, you should basically require that in your purchasing guidelines. And for public sector now, I think that's been standard for quite a while, so that should be straightforward. Is it possible to make a flowchart accessible? Well, it kind of depends on the flowchart. I would imagine if I Google for flowchart, pretty sure there'll be some. So if you could find, there we go, simple. If I got something like this, I don't know what this is. There you go. That you could probably explain that in a couple of sentences. Wouldn't be a problem. But I can imagine you could easily find some complex ones that would be horrendous. And yeah, there you go. Good luck with that one, right? In fact, the example of that flowchart is almost to make the point that it's awful. So if you had alt text for this, it would probably be insanely complicated flowchart that no one could understand because, you couldn't really do much else with it. So it's always difficult, right? Like in a way, like for example, we have captions are designed to make video content accessible, and if you're like hard of hearing and you watch the TV, captions are amazing because they make content available to you that otherwise you would miss. But they don't obviously convey every last aspect of the voice of the actors and actresses and so on. They'll lose something, but there's enough there that you can use it. So I guess if a flowchart is doing something like telling you, let's think of a useful flowchart. Do I need to apply for a visa for something, and that information is only in an image like this, that's probably a bigger problem anyway. You probably should find a way to describe it so that it isn't. Right, development plan. Wow, we've got a lot of questions. This is good. In fact, we're actually running out of time. I'm going to have to speed up. Development plans, strategic plans, financial results, etc. Very long PDF documents, too long HTML pages. Should we exclude these from our site? It's possible to make PDFs accessible to, well, at least to some level, and there is a exclusion within the EU guidelines that basically allows for content that is disproportionately troublesome to translate. You don't want to completely destroy the experience and value of your site. What you might have to do is put some of those on there, and in your accessibility guidelines, or possibly a disclaimer around them, say something like, please note these historical documents are not as yet available in, fully accessible PDFs or HTML form. If this is an issue, please contact us here, that kind of thing. In reality, it's probably not too much of a burden. And if someone does email you, you could either talk them through it, or you could potentially, extract the relevant content for them, or something like that. And you probably wouldn't have that issue, but you would be endeavoring to provide that service. Or, as you say, alternatively, just remove them. But I would prefer to have the data myself. I think most of your constituents would prefer to have it, as long as you caveat it appropriately. Do accessibility regulations trump other statutory obligations to publish potentially inaccessible content? Can we use regulations to say no? Not entirely sure I follow the question. Generally, the requirements, if you go into the specifics, you'll actually find they do have reasonable exemptions for things that are just completely and utterly impractical. Like I mentioned, for example, you need to not scroll horizontally and vertically at the same time, but they understand that there are exemptions for that. If you have an app that there's literally no other choice, like Google Maps, for example, can't work without that. So Google Maps is not prohibited because it just couldn't exist if it wasn't done in that way. So like, if there is literally no other way to make something work, then like you can't describe Google Maps through text, right? Then you're still allowed to do Google Maps. So it's just, what you shouldn't be doing is putting content up there that is the only way to do something important, and then just not bothering to make it accessible, essentially. And that's quite a reasonable ask, actually. That's, it's like, again, it's the analogy of a supermarket and saying, oh, we're not going to care about letting people in with disabilities. Like, what on earth is wrong with you? This is 2020. And for a website, that is probably a bigger deal. So, yeah. How do you account for the positioning of your sites in your league table that have been accredited by organizations? I don't quite know how to answer that question. How do you account for the positioning of sites? I think I know what you mean. What you're saying is, so some organizations in our league table have been accredited. So I kind of covered this earlier with why there are differences. As I said, the criteria between like manual and automated testing is different. We're looking in the league table at 125 pages. My guess is your manual testing is different. Websites are not static. The criteria are not static. It is entirely possible that you were accredited, for example, to WCAG 2.0, and we're accrediting WCAG 2.1. Literally, there's about 100 and something subjective criteria within WCAG. So there's a whole ton of reasons. Without the specifics, I can't really say, but I'm happy to follow up on that later if someone wants to ask. Any tips for encouraging staff across service areas to engage with accessibility requirements? Oh, right. Okay. Yes. Okay. Yeah, there's good training and there's bad. I personally, the short version is I would recommend showing people why it matters. I think that the biggest problem with and this is actually, I'm trying to fix this in my book, but the biggest problem with most accessibility training is it's typically something like, here is a list of things you should not do, or maybe here's a list of things you should do, and that's it, right? And if you deprive people of the reasoning, or like a reasoning they can relate to, it won't work. So you can't just say, oh, add alt text because it's the law, or add alt text because blind users need it. What you need to do is say, use a screen reader, and I'm going to show you this is what a page looks like, or what it sounds like to someone who's blind. Let's look at our own page using just a keyboard and see how awful that is, and then compare it with something like gov.uk, which does it brilliantly, and we'll see why this matters. And then it's easier to advocate, I think. So we've done webinars in that mold in the past. I think there's a couple recorded on our website, but failing that, there's other organizations that are good at training. So you could look into that. Index update, we answered that one. When, if ever, should you use? Yeah, we answered that one. Software to use to recommend to test forms. I mean, we test forms. The most basic requirements in WCAG are relatively straightforward. We check for those. If you're looking at interactions with forms, so you've got things like error messages, you need, well, we actually provide an option for that. You need to teach our software to fill in a form. So there's looking at a form just like without filling it in, and you can test certain things there. But if you want to find things like, does it handle errors in a certain way? Does it, what else? Does it validate? Does it, provide feedback when it's done? That kind of thing. That's, we can sort of teach it a little bit more there. Or to be honest, a lot of the time it's just more subjective. You want to look at it manually. What is the point in publishing league tables of automated tests? It provides a consistent overview of a wide range of websites, so basically all websites, and helps give you some understanding of how you fit within your peers, as well as the status of the industry as a whole. Do you have experience of checking send local offer websites, RECAG? I don't personally, sorry, probably can't help you with that one. If we all have PDFs which fail on mobiles, how do any of us score 100% in the results table? Basically, you usually don't. So the criteria we're actually measuring you for in the index is based on the automated criteria for, let me think now, I need to get this right. Yes, for single, double, and treble A, we do include treble A. You shouldn't generally expect to score 100%. Like I said, even the people who made the standard would probably not score 100%. If you're getting like 90 or 95 or something, you're doing incredible, right? So that's great. But to literally be 100% and flawless, you would probably not have much of a website. Unfortunately, that's just the way accessibility works. Like I said, it's a continuum from really great experience down to a totally awful, unusable experience. So I wouldn't really aim for the 100. I'd just be aiming to score really, really well. Can we enable Silktide results to be filtered, simulate? I guess that's similar to Better Connected. Yes, actually, we're working on that. That's already something that's in our list. How do we make tables? We answered that one. Supplement to the, Maidstone's current #1 table has a score of 100%. Oh, okay. Well, let me have a look. I've not even seen that. Sorry, I don't check. They might actually be scoring like 99 point something. Well, they've got 8 PDFs. I mean, as far as, so we don't, just so you understand with PDFs, we will score you 100% for a PDF if you're doing everything right with the PDF that is considered best practice under WCAG. I think there's a bit of political sensitivity with PDFs in WCAG, and they don't particularly like talking about things like reflow, which is a WCAG 2.1 guideline. But we don't grade you for that. So basically, that site appears to be doing everything right. I haven't actually looked at this in detail myself, so let me just double check. It is, yeah, wow, it is 100. Wow, well done. Although, no, I say that, it's like 99.8. So it's technically it's got a couple of snags, but it rounds up to 100. Okay, we are pretty much out of time, but I'll just, I don't know, Dave, if you're okay, I'll carry on another 5 minutes because it looks like we're right at the end.
I was going to say, if everyone's happy, we'll cover the 11 questions we've still got before the end of the session, if that's okay. Fine
with me. Okay. Fantastic. All right. So, what is the process for registering a new website with Silktide Index? So what we do is the index is designed to be free, and it's not free for us, but it's designed to be free. So we are testing a consistent list of websites in the public sector to provide a like leaderboard. It isn't possible for us to say just test any random website. So imagine if you, for the sake of argument, we've got a list of councils, right? But imagine you come to us with a website that is a microsite detached from a main council. If we were to test that, we would have to test all of the microsites, if that makes sense. of which there are a huge number, and it would be somewhat impractical for us to identify and update that list of microsites, whereas it's relatively feasible for us to update the main list of actual sites. So if you've got a website that you believe meets the criteria, we should be, like, for example, if there's a council we're missing, please let us know. We'll just add that for free. There's no cost. But if you've got a website that doesn't really belong in one of the sections, then we can't really add it without adding all of the other things in that section, because it wouldn't really make sense otherwise. Like, if we decided to do, I don't know, US state government websites or something, then we wouldn't just add one, we'd have to add all of them, because otherwise there isn't much of a comparison with their peers. Infographics is kind of the same answer, really. I mean, the thing is, what you're trying to do is avoid, just think of it as avoiding discrimination. Is there information that you have presented in an infographic that you simply couldn't get any other way, right? So the infographic might contain key information like, this is our response rate on this, or this is the number of people who have been hospitalized from this, or whatever. And if you've got that information and it's only in an image, well, then you are denying accessibility. But you don't have to describe the infographic as there is a box in the left and it has an arrow pointing to a box on the right. You just have to include the key information in, say, a text form. And that holds for any kind of multimedia. We have large local planning docs, which include very detailed maps, moving PDFs to HTML, but struggling with this one. Again, it's basically the same thing. A map cannot be, it is specifically excluded. You can't do a flawless copy. You can't, but you convey the information as best as you can in a text form. And if you can't, then you literally just explain that. But usually saying something like your address and maybe saying it's opposite the river or next to the fire station or whatever, that kind of thing is useful, but that's about as far as you can go. Okay, so that's a repeat. Is the side scrolling issue reported on many websites caused by cookie control banner? It can be exacerbated or caused by a cookie banner, it's true. It's quite common to have plugins that make your site inaccessible or less accessible. I can't say if there's a solution in cookie control because I don't know that product personally that well, but maybe. If you've got a specific example, email me and yeah, happy to look at that. What would be your recommended approach to tackle non-compliant PDFs? Well, we kind of went into this earlier, but I think, to be honest, if people want it, just ask for a talk on PDFs. I could do an hour on that one easily. Is side scroll issues duplicates? What about using graphical images, data sets to pick meaning, pie charts and bar charts? Yeah, again, it just comes down to really making sure you've got, it's the information that's within it. Are you denying someone who couldn't see an image, something that is, they should be reasonably expected to have access to? You can't just go, we're going to only put this key information, like a map or something. We're going to put our address inside a PDF that is an image and it can't be read, right? Because then people don't know what your address is. That's ridiculous. But on the other hand, you obviously can't describe every line and color and shade of a PDF, and you don't need to. When checking my score, an accessibility table differs to other accessibility checkers. Again, I covered that in quite a bit of detail earlier on, why there are differences between tools. It's a complicated question and a complicated answer. We published neighborhood plans PDF. Who's adopted the plan? Okay. You're responsible as the website owner is the short version. So if you imagine you took someone else's PDF and put it on your website, it's not their problem to fix it, it's yours. So yeah, basically you're responsible as the owner. What are the main points we need to cover? Oh, goodness. There are hundreds, literally. The main points, we did publish I believe Socitm's published a PDF on the top 5 very recently. And honestly, the main thing you should do is you should look at your report because it's free and you've already got one. And we'll summarize the top points for your specific website, which can be different from other websites. PDFs are usually a big part of it, but I would just, I would look at the report and see what it says. And there we go. That was nice and easy. So I think that's basically it. I'm going to skip this. I had some extra material in case we ran out of time. I didn't have any questions, but that wasn't really an issue. So great. I hope that was useful. I believe David has said there's a recording of this, so I'm sure that'll be distributed afterwards. If any of you are curious, that toolbar is free and you can download it from silktide.com/toolbar. That just helps you simulate common accessibility issues. And of course, the index, I'm sure you're all familiar with, silktide.com/index. And that's it for me today. Thank you very much for your time. Yes, unfortunately. So the trouble is, if you took it to its logical extreme,
Yeah.
you're not responsible, for example, for web browsers or for HTML or for a million other things that are outside your control. But just because, like, for example, you might use Word to create PDFs, and depending on the options you set, you make them accessible or inaccessible.
Yep.
But that isn't Microsoft's fault, because if it was, well, the whole world would be sued left, right, and center. We just couldn't, operate. So, so the responsibility is clearly defined as a website owner. Usually, as a public sector organization, what that means is setting your procurement requirements to stipulate you must make this accessible content, et cetera, et cetera. For older content, there are varying levels of, I hesitate to say exemption, but more like understanding or tolerance for content that is older, or in some cases more impractical to update. If you are really stuck with something and there's just no way you can see it practically being turned, like say you had a 20,000 page PDF that was written by someone else 10 years ago, right? Or you scanned the US Constitution into a PDF, you can't really, there's only so much you can do. But you would reasonably try to explain it. So you might say something like, there's a PDF, please note this PDF is not, accessible. If this is a problem for you, this is the reason you have an accessibility statement. If this is a problem for you, you want to explain it. So you can say something like, you can email us at accessibility at whatever, or something like that. And then the idea is, as long as someone can actually help them, because someone might call up and say, look, I'm a blind user and I'm trying to access this information for a research project I'm doing, or they're doing their undergraduate or something study on, and they need some statistics that are only available in one of these awkward PDFs. It's not likely, but it does happen, and it's like freedom of information requests. As long as you can reasonably get back to them, and it's not, then that will cover you.